Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Sive, a guest with Sophie and Kelly on the Voter In segment of Two Broads. And welcome to this show. We're really excited about doing this. We're hoping that you'll find it interesting and valuable and inspirational. And most important, we're looking forward to sharing what we know and working together to make this dream of voting in our next woman president come true. So let your friends know, welcome, and let's get going. Thanks.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. We are back for our 5th episode of the Vote Her In series. I am here with my co-host Sophie. Hey Sophie.
Hey Kelly.
And joining us again is our partner in this venture, author Rebecca Sive. Hi Rebecca.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us again. So for listeners who have not been listening to the full Vote Her In series, you should go back and listen to the first 4 episodes. But we are talking about the effort to elect the first woman president. And this is an especially good time to be doing it because there are so many women running for president. So we're going to continue the discussion that we were having in the 4th part of this series, talking about some of the systemic issues that women face in becoming elected, being elected to executive positions, but especially to the presidency. So, Rebecca, where would you like to pick up our conversation on this?
Well, we covered a lot of ground the other day, but, there were some things we touched on, and I thought we could delve more deeply, and particularly now that I think the race is, really heating up. And I just read this morning that the Mueller report's going to be released soon. And so these candidates are going to, I'm guessing, be in a whole new phase of, what they're saying and doing and campaigning. And it may well be, depending on what's said about the Mueller report, for instance, that there are some women on the Republican side who, make some noise. And so in that context, I thought we might, start today's discussion by talking about the fact that it's, not a given, and we should say that out loud and discuss it, that the first woman president will be a pro-choice woman or even a Democrat, right? And that there are certainly women on the Republican side. There may be some independent women who, who decide to run just as men have, who don't share the sort of progressive agenda that the 4 main candidates on the Democratic side share. And so I thought that would be important for us to look at. And, there's been a lot of discussion in the past about Nikki Haley. And, after she resigned from the UN ambassador position a few months ago, of course, she was asked, well, is your next step running for president? And she said, of course, no. But then in the meanwhile, and you probably saw this too, she's got a book coming out. She's got some think tank projects. And there's really, the possibility of that. And what does that mean, for women if we have a woman president who's anti-choice and quite conservative on other women's issues?
Yeah, and I think sometimes Republicans maybe like to be voting, in general, they don't seem to like women's issues, but I think sometimes they sort of give themselves an out when they vote for women of, well, look, we support strong women too. And there are Republican women like Kellyanne Conway who like to play this sort of feminism card, even though, really what they're doing is often not all that supportive of other women or women's rights in general. But, I think that we very well could see that, just like we saw Sarah Palin nominated for vice president, who is, certainly no friend to women's issues.
Well, it's sort of an interesting question because I recently read a book about the history of the Ku Klux Klan in the mid-20th century and basically in the 1920s. And there was a whole chapter on the women leaders of the Klan. And I mean, I don't think I'd ever heard about this before, but the author, who's a brilliant historian, made the point that there's no sort of automatic connection between a progressive view on issues, whether it's racism or sexism, and being a leader, wanting to be a leader, asserting yourself. And so it's a sort of really tough question. And I kind of feel that, when I was writing my book, I had to grapple with it because people would say to me, well, what do you think if that, how are you going to feel if that woman we first elect is anti-choice and doesn't support equal pay? And, it's something for all of us to consider. Is it worth more, so to speak, to have women's voices there, notwithstanding their views on some issues, and maybe they'll be good on a few others? I think that's something we all have to face.
Yeah, I mean, I know that I personally would come down to voting for a progressive Democrat over voting for a Republican woman, even if that means voting for a man. But I think it's a definite thing we need to think about. I mean, luckily for those of us who need to make those choices, the Republicans aren't running that many women, comparatively speaking. But it definitely could happen, and it could be something that it's a choice that we need to make.
Well, and it's also true that there's been, after the 2018 congressional elections, where, the overwhelming number of the women elected were Democrats, that, some were really bemoaning the fact that there weren't women on the other side, because those women tend to be more in the middle, perhaps more mainstream on issues that women care about. So, it's a tough thing. And I would just say one other thing about it that struck me reading the news of this last week or so, and all the discussion about Joe Biden and his, behavior. And, I have been in this long enough to remember when Joe Biden, Paul Simon, and many other upstanding Democrats in the minds of progressives were anti-choice. Dick Durbin was too. And, we couldn't just say, well, we couldn't just forget about them. They were in power. They had a role to play. They had voices. They kept being reelected. So I think that it may be the case that, if we're faced with this fact that there are Republican women running who look like they have a chance, that we really will want, or our Republican sisters who are more in a position to do it, work hard to try to convince them to change their minds, just as feminists did 30 years ago and changed Dick Durbin's mind. You can't let that go, I don't think.
Could a woman, win the Republican primary, though? I keep coming back to this idea that one of the reasons women do so well in the Democratic primaries is because the Democratic base and the Democratic voter pool is heavily female. And the people who tend to vote in Republican primaries are often more heavily male. And so I feel like the people at this juncture, the people who are in the Republican Party who are voting, in these primaries most of the time are going to be the people who have not found the last, say 4 years of Republican politics so horrific that they've left, and therefore are more likely to be the type of people who consciously or subconsciously wouldn't vote for a woman. So I'm wondering, do you think they could even get through?
It's a really important point you're raising, but I think it's interesting. I mean, just as we saw in this recent, announcement yesterday of yet another man running in a Democratic primary, I mean, there could be a lot of people, right? And then the votes get split, and then the discussion occurs about, well, who's a person who can bring us all together and have a chance to, pull over people who are independent or conservative Democrats. So I would postulate, we don't know, right? It's a really important point, but that if, say, Nikki Haley were in it, she would be a person, who could make that case, and she would say, I'm more electable at this point in a one-on-one, so pick me in this primary. And of course, she might not prevail, but she would position herself for the future and say the Democrat is a male candidate. Then once again, we're looking at electing our first woman president. It's all kind of a mystery right now, but you're right. There's a lot going on.
Yeah. And, I think that this is something that a lot of the organizations that are training women to run for office are also thinking about, right? So we have organizations like Emily's List, for instance, that will only help pro-choice Democratic women. But, there are plenty of organizations that are training women who also want to be training Republican women to run for office. And, I don't know what the numbers look like. I don't know how many Republican women are stepping up to run for office with these training programs. But it's definitely something that, it's interesting to see which organizations choose to go which way with that.
Well, and it's also true. I've done a fair amount of work with Vote, Run, Lead, which is an example of those that are nonpartisan. And, they make a very strong and powerful and convincing argument about the importance of training every woman who wants to run. And so, how those numbers break out, I'm not sure. And their big victories, this past year were Democratic women, at least at the congressional level. But the case there about women coming together is a powerful one. And, we just sort of have to see who can really, move out there, because you're right. It's hard to run in a Republican primary when the women are generally more liberal. I think the other thing related to this is another factor which we hadn't yet talked about, which I think is really important, Republican or Democrat. And that's the issue of how long one has been in public service and the sort of the burden, so to speak, of a lifetime of votes. And I know we're going to be discussing the recent Chicago mayoral in greater detail in our next episode, but I wanted to just touch on that here too, because, there's a strong case to be made that among the challenges Hillary Clinton had was, all these votes, all this record, all these issues she had staked out a position on, for instance, by contrast to Barack Obama. So in 2008. And, that's something that I think women really have to take a look at. And in the case of this recent mayoral, the woman who won, Lori Lightfoot, had never run for office before. So she hadn't held the seat from which she had taken a lot of votes. So that's another issue. I think that sort of this systemic challenge that the women have is if they work their way up the ladder gradually, as has been the case for most women who hold office, what do they do with that long resume? By contrast, say, to Mayor Pete or Eric Swalwell, who's, they're 37 and 38, and they don't have that kind of track record people can poke at.
Yeah. And as people have been pointing out in the media recently, women run for office later. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that happens, partly because raising families, partly because they, on average need to be asked a lot more times to run for office first. And this is true in the workplace as well as it is in running for office, that women run for office that they think they can get or apply for jobs that they, think they meet every single requirement for, and men are much more likely to reach. So if women are running for office later, they're going to have a lot more things in their history. Whether it's in elected office or not, there's just a lot more life to to have made decisions that may be questionable or things that people could spin. If you're Pete Buttigieg and you're 37 years old, there just isn't that much of your life that, that people can be critiquing, as opposed to if you're, Elizabeth Warren and you're 69 years old. So this is not just true of women versus men, but if women are by and large running, especially for the presidency or executive offices like mayor or governor much later in life, that is something that they're going to have to think about how to navigate. And we're going to have to think about how to make sure that we're looking at people on sort of an equal ground and remembering that long history can be a good thing as well.
Yeah, I think it's also the case that what we're seeing, and again, to go to the Chicago example, people are, both men and women, now deciding, I don't know what the sort of percentages are, but that they're going to run for whatever office they want to run for, regardless of whether they've ever held office or whether that's an office for which arguably they have little, at least, job experience, so to speak. They may have an inclination and an aptitude. And so obviously the biggest example was Donald Trump, right? But people are increasingly doing that. And I think that with the women who won, congressional seats, certainly the bigger names, in several cases that was true for them. So I'm kind of thinking here that I need to figure it out some more, but there's something of a difference between the older generation like Elizabeth Warren, as you point out, years of experience, years of holding different jobs, lots of track record, and these younger women who are, angry and also gifted and just say, I'm running for Congress, right? Mm-hmm. So it's then of course they do have to worry about, what may be in their personal background, as anyone does, but at least they don't have that burden of that long resume and long list of votes, which may be a good thing.
I was just going to note that I will have the burden of, 200 plus podcast episodes that people can listen to exactly how I feel about things if and when I ever run.
Right. That gets to, something else, which is that when one decides at the young age, so take these young women who are now in Congress, they're going to have many votes, right? Mm-hmm. Just like you have many podcasts. So if any one of them decides, gee, I want to, run for New York senator or whatever, they're going to have to face that as well. Or decide, well, gee whiz, I'm going to stay here because I've got seniority and I do have a track record. And of course, I would say going to one other issue that we've wanted to touch on is something that's always been true, I think, regardless of age or experience, and that is the notion that, as Shirley Chisholm put it, sexism trumped racism. That she had felt she had experienced more discrimination as a woman than as an African American. And this hasn't been said, but in the case of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, the choice was a man of color versus a woman. And how do we think about that? Was that also an example of what Chisholm was talking about? That ultimately for an executive office like the presidency, what we want is a guy, because guys run things. I think this is, kind of under the table, so to speak, sort of behind closed doors. People don't like to talk about it. Some people argue about it, but the history seems to hold on it.
So it will be even more interesting, of course, if our first woman president is Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. And if we have a woman of color, if we sort of can break a bunch of barriers all at once, and I think that in some ways, so the same as, what we saw in the Chicago election, that women of color have historically been doing so much of the work of progressive politics, of Democrats, and I think that a lot of us are recognizing that and saying we need to elevate that. And because they've been doing that work, there are people who have been around, been doing important things for so long that, if you can start to recognize women's work, that one of the things you will recognize is how much a role the women of color have been playing.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think it's also the case that the sort of the individual person, Kamala Harris, is a really good example. I mean, she was a first in her other elected positions, right? Mm-hmm. And so those women, just like the men who are first, they have such incredible courage, right? And personal strength. And so I think that, while you're right that lots of different kinds of women, including women of color, have been the backbone of progressive politics, it's also true that for those who are going to seek these highest positions, they really have to be personally prepared. And I think and personally prepared when they step out for a form of sexism, so to speak, that the rest of us won't experience because we're not stepping out that way.
Right.
Which, of course, makes it all the more notable that they're doing that. Also something that applies today to the white women in a major party, because as we've discussed before, that's only a very recent phenomenon, right? So these women generally are just sort of remarkable people, and I think probably understand, even if they don't mention it, that I'm prepared to break down these barriers. I have the courage to do it and to keep on doing it if, for instance, I lose, as Clinton did. Well, I ran again, right?
Yeah.
And my guess is that for the women who are running now, it may not be the last time if they don't prevail either.
Yeah, I think that's something we didn't see at all of, for better or worse, in 2016, that we're really seeing in 2018. Clearly, most of the people running are not going to win the nomination, but so many of them, it feels like they're either saying, well, if I run, that's good national exposure for potential VP slot, or, this is great for 4 years from now, 8 years from now, when I run again. Obviously that's not true of Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, but, for people like Pete Buttigieg, does he expect to win? I don't know, but clearly a lot more people know who he is now than did 2 months ago.
Yeah, it's an interesting question as to whether, sort of once you put yourself out there, right, male or female, you're subject to all kinds of scrutiny, right? And you're subject to all kinds of rules and regulations regarding running a campaign or being a candidate. So you're right that the good news is they get themselves out there and their name gets noticed and they're prepared to run again in most cases if they don't win the first time. On the other hand, they really have to take stock of what's my life like, right? And so which just goes back to, in my view, just such admiration for these women. And just, aren't we lucky, so to speak? Aren't we fortunate that we can have such people decide to run and put themselves out there for president, for mayor, for whatever it is. And I kind of feel, since we're just kind of recovering from this Chicago election, that's so important to say out loud. We are blessed, right, that these women are willing to do this and that we're able to talk about it and be supportive and, put our shoulders to the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we'll, keep talking about the 2020 candidates, but one thing that has been just so amazing to see is how much the women are supporting each other who are running. You don't see Kamala and Elizabeth Warren taking jabs at each other. You see them supporting each other and calling out each other's good ideas. And that's just incredible. And so such a breath of fresh air, really.
I feel like 2016 was terrible, and I would obviously change it if I could. But the one good thing that's come out of it is that I feel like it's activated so many women and made them realize that, we have to support other women candidates specifically in a way that I don't know whether we would have been activated all at once in this way if 2016 hadn't shaken out the way that it did.
No, I think you're right. There's no evidence to suggest that as many women were activated in this way ever before. So hopefully we can, make something wonderful come of it. So far some wonderful things already have, but wouldn't the presidency be the best, right?
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to keeping talking, and particularly looking forward to our next episode when I think it would be good to take a closer look at this Chicago election, absolutely in the context we just were in, about how women, both the candidates, the one who won, the one who lost, and the new women in the city council, and those of us who've been active, what lessons we can pull from that about how women can organize nationally. And I would just put one thing in the minds of the listeners as you think about this. it's the case that, and I believe this is unique, that together, Lori Lightfoot, who will be mayor of Chicago in a month or so, and Tony Preckwinkle, who's president of the Cook County Board, together are now running a regional set of two governments larger than close to half the states, right?
Yeah.
With responsibility for health care and criminal justice and economic development. And what a wide open, wonderful opportunity there is there for them to sort of show the way, for instance, for what women presidents could do. So I'm looking forward to the conversation in that context.
And I just wanted to say that here in Madison, not only did we just elect a woman as mayor, but we now have our first all-female school board of the Madison Metropolitan School District, which has been really exciting to see because a lot of the women, normally the school board is a nonpartisan election, and so people run for specific seats, and that was still true, but a lot of the women teamed up. Several of them ran like co-campaigns together, saying, you know, if you vote for me, you should also vote for her. And it worked out really well because now we have an all-female school board. So we're also it's going to be exciting to see what happens in Madison, too, as our leadership becomes almost exclusively female.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Well, just look at what we have, you know, these women running things, right? Yay, I say.
All right. Well, that is a nice happy note to end things on. For this episode, we'll be back in 2 weeks again, and we'll dive in a little more to the Chicago election and some lessons that we learned there. So thank you once again, Sophie and Rebecca, for joining me today. And this is exciting. We'll keep talking about how we vote her in. Of course, everyone should feel free to tweet at us, Facebook, Instagram, email, carrier pigeon, however you'd like to reach us. We will be happy to talk to you.
Thanks.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.